Okay, we're moving on to our last section, ladies and gentlemen, before lunch. And again, I'm delighted that we're going to have, similar to earlier, we have a short presentation followed by a panel discussion on the subject of farming and the environment meeting the challenges. When it comes to farming and the environment, both are challenged and both challenge each other. The two issues are inextricably linked on many layers. They contradict each other, as we heard earlier on, yet they complement as well. And it's been seen as a source, farming being seen as a source of environmental damage. On one hand, it is also, of course, farming and agriculture can be the solution. We should also remember, for a clean environment makes for a clean canvas in order to produce clean food. And the other pertinent question is, how can we continue to produce safe, traceable, affordable food for a growing global population in an environmentally safe, welfare-friendly, and of course, financially viable way for the food producer? As custodians of the countryside and food producers, where does the balance now lie in managing both? Well, to discuss, our next panel will be coming forward very soon. But first of all, to give us a short overview of the Government Climate Action Plan, I want to welcome to the podium Mark Griffin, who's Secretary-General at the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment. And Mark will stay with us on the panel, and then I'll introduce you to our other three panelists. So Mark, it's over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Damien. The name of the department actually belies a lot of other things that we do, including broadband, which very important for the rural communities, smart farming in particular, which we'll talk about in a moment. I was very interested in the title of the presentation, Farming and the Environment Meeting the Challenge. And I've been in the environment space for a long time, moved to the Department of the Environment from the Department of Finance in 1995, and the sense that I always had is that when the agriculture sector and environment policy met, there was a challenge. And I've been sitting down with Tom Moran this morning. I know Tom well from when he was Sec-Gen in agriculture, and we've had many discussions on how you get the balance right between what you need to do and should do in terms of environment policy and the needs of the agriculture sector, and those conversations have continued with Tom's successor, Brendan Gleeson. And I was very taken with Nick's comments a few moments ago about the need for the industry to look at the opportunities. And of course, we recognize the challenges that the environment agenda in particular and the climate agenda, which has become very important over the last 12 months. So it's important for us as a system, a government system, that we work closely together and we get it right and we strike a right balance. I know you'll have heard from several speakers this morning about the important contribution that the agri-food sector makes to employment in rural Ireland, the value added to the economy, and I've looked at the research that was conducted by Board BIA, and there's no question but that Irish agriculture has strong green credentials and a positive international reputation. But what's also clear is that environmental responsibility is becoming of far greater interest and concern to consumers. So I suppose the challenge for the sector is, in order to ensure good prices for Irish producers in the medium to long term and access to markets, we need to ensure that we meet our climate obligations, that the product produced in Ireland is as carbon efficient as possible, and that we maintain the green brand image. Before I do a bit of a dive into the Climate Action Plan, it's actually really interesting to see what's happening at EU and international level. You may have got a flavour of that this morning from a former boss of mine, Phil Hogan. Huge concern at international level about climate change, the climate impacts that we're seeing right across the world. We're seeing them in Ireland in terms of the increased floods, the fodder shortages over the last few years and so on, and the practical impact that's happening at a farm level. So you have the Paris Agreement that was settled in 2015, long-term goal to keep the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperatures increases to 1.5% above pre-industrial levels. You had the IPCC report in October last year, reinforcing again the need to do everything we possibly can to address the climate challenge that is manifesting itself right across the globe. We in Ireland are part of the EU effort. The EU has committed to, as part of its nationally determined contribution, to a 40% reduction in EU-wide emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. And that comprises a 43% reduction in the ETS sector and a 30% reduction in the non-ETS sector, which of course agriculture is part of. Again, it's interesting to see the perspective of the incoming Commission, and the very first thing that the incoming President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in her opening statement to the European Parliament when she was going through her confirmation hearings was that she wants Europe to become the first climate neutral continent in the world by 2050. So that's a massive challenge for everybody right across Europe, all the sectors involved. So turning to our own climate action plan, our target is a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the non-ETS sector by 2030. And I've often said to the guys in the department working with me that we actually need to shift the dial somewhat and stop talking about targets and set a vision for what we want the economy, the society and the country to look like in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, because in creating that vision at national, regional and local level, you have the opportunity to make people far more engaged than that sense of something that is being imposed on you from the centre, whether it's from a government department in Dublin or whether it's from the European Commission. So agriculture currently accounts for a third of our greenhouse gas emissions and 46% of our non-ETS emissions. And the long-term challenge for the sector is to meet the national policy objective of an approach to carbon neutrality which does not compromise our capacity for sustainable food production. We published the Climate Action Plan in June. So for the first time, the government has set out the measures that are required to meet our 2030 targets with the burden shared across all sectors. So electricity, agriculture, built environment, transport have all very ambitious targets that need to be met. And the aim in setting the measures, the policies, the actions for 2030 and the overall target is that it puts us on the path for net zero by 2050. The plan was informed by the work of the Citizens' Assembly, which I think did a fantastic job in really engaging with the issues around climate action. The all-party Oireachtas Climate Action Committee did a huge amount of additional work on top of that. All Secretary Generals were hauled before the committee, and as is their wont, we were abused for our lack of action on this issue in previous years. Myself, Brendan, a range of other colleagues had to account for ourselves before the committee when they were doing their work. And of course, they spoke to other stakeholder groups, including the farmer groups. The sense is, and I've been around the environment space for a long, long time, and what you see in terms of the environment and economic cycles is that when the economy is going well, people feel that they can afford the environment. But my sense this time around, when you see the level of public interest, both nationally and internationally, that irrespective of the next economic downturn, and inevitably there will be, given the nature of economic cycles, the environment, sustainability, and of course we've heard the discussion about what that actually means, climate action will be really, really important for us as we move forward over the next number of years. The plan has a strong focus on implementation. It has actions, it has specific timelines, clear lines of responsibility and steps needed for their achievement. A Climate Action Delivery Board has been established, is co-chaired by myself and by Martin Fraser, the Secretary General to the Government. It comprises the Secretary Generals of all the relevant government departments, including Brendan Gleeson from Agriculture. We're meeting next Wednesday to review progress on the Q2 and Q3 actions and see where we are in terms of Q4 and early into 2020. And then there's the further political oversight by a cabinet committee chaired by the Taoiseach, which we expect to meet before the end of the month. I think the important thing in terms of the plan is that we have made our best assessment as to the range of policies across sectors that will deliver the reduction that's required by 2030. Now, plan is not set in stone. We update it annually. There are technologies that have not yet been developed that will form part of the achievement of the targets by 2030, and again, which will have a very important role as you look out to 2050. So we have to be nimble enough to ensure that we back the right horses, that we allocate the appropriate burden or share of effort across sectors, and that as we do the further deep dive on policies, again, that we're nimble enough to be able to say, well, actually, that's not going to work. We need to park it, or else actually it'll work in a way and have an impact that we didn't expect when we set it out, and again, to make that balance within sectors and across sectors. So some of the key sectoral actions, we're increasing our reliance on renewable electricity from 30% to 70%. We're phasing out coal and peat-fired generation. We're putting in place a coherent support scheme for microgen, which will be of interest to a lot of you, with a price for selling power to the grid. We're opening up opportunities for community participation in renewable generation. We're setting stricter requirements for new buildings and substantial refurbishments. We're designing policy to upgrade 500,000 homes to BER B2. We're building a supply chain, a model for aggregation where home retrofits are grouped together. We're accelerating the penetration of electric vehicles. We're increasing the renewable biofuel content of motor fuels, and we're making growth less transport intensive. So just to turn then briefly to the Climate Action Plan and the agriculture sector. So the action plan is about future-proofing the agriculture sector. It's about building on the work that has already been done by government, by state agencies like Teagasc, the SCAI, Board BIA, the EPA, the voluntary initiatives that have already been undertaken, and most importantly, the initiatives that farmers in the agri-food industry have already undertaken themselves. And these initiatives include the agri-environment programs and schemes funded through the CAP, schemes like the GLAS scheme, which is targeted at combating climate change, protecting water quality and promoting biodiversity. Over 200,000 carbon assessments have been completed as part of Board BIA's Origin Green programme, and each year smart farming resource efficiency studies are completed on at least 50 farms, and Andrew, who will be on the panel with us in a moment, has a lot of experience in that regard. So these programmes have done a lot, and we're seeing positive progress over the last number of years. For those of you who are present when the plan was launched, Minister Creed said, a further step up is necessary in the sector. That means making changes on each and every one of our 139,000 plus farms. This is not going to be easy. Change is never easy, and some of these measures will take time to deliver. However, it's critical that we take action now, because maintaining our green credentials is fundamental to underpinning the competitiveness of our agri-food sector. We've also put a lot of store on what's going to emerge from the next round of the CAP. Negotiations are obviously still ongoing. The Commission proposal is for 40% of the overall budget of the new CAP at EU level to contribute to environmental or climate action based on verifiable results. We support that enhanced ambition, including the opportunity to focus the funding on climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity and carbon sequestration and storage measures, while ensuring a just transition to a more diversified and decarbonised, vibrant rural economy. However, it's essential that the new environmental conditionality is implemented effectively with common standards that are relevant and effective. We worked very closely with Teagasc and with the Department of Agriculture in the development of the plan. We had a public forum back in January. There were 200 plus stakeholders involved, including a lot of the farming organisations. And we believe that, and again, taking account of the Teagasc MAC curve, the overarching MAC curve that was prepared for the totality of the sectors by McKinsey, we believe that we have, at this stage, the right mix of measures in place within sectors and across sectors. Some of the key sectoral actions for agriculture in the climate plan include delivering sustainable, verifiable greenhouse gas abatement through adoption of a specified range of improvements in farming practice in line with the recommendations from the Teagasc MAC curve. Delivering an expansion of forestry planting and soil management to ensure that carbon abatement from land use is delivered in the period up until 2030 and in the years beyond. Supporting diversification within agriculture and land use to develop sustainable and circular value chains and business models for lower carbon intensity farming. A key priority, of course, is to deliver the measures set out in the Teagasc MAC curve. These measures include both efficiency measures, such as the improvements in breed efficiency of dairy and beef cows, and technical measures such as changes in fertilizer type or low-emission slurry spreading. There are other opportunities that we've spelt out, some of them which will be supported by our own department, things like the development of anaerobic digestion, the production of bioenergy, the development of the wider bioeconomy to turn renewable biological resources and residual side streams into value-added bio-based products and increased levels of afforestation. We're funding schemes already that will be of use on farm in terms of support scheme for renewable heat. That will support anaerobic digestion by agricultural, commercial, industrial, district heating and other non-domestic heat users in the non-ETS sector. It'll also stimulate demand for renewable energy feedstocks such as biomass. On the broader renewable energy piece, I've said we're going to move from 30% to 70%. That's going to involve a huge amount of cooperation by farmers and farm owners right across the state. We're looking at ways of ensuring greater involvement and a greater benefit for people in rural communities. We're looking at options like a mandatory requirement for all projects looking for support under the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme to offer investment opportunities to local citizens and communities, financial supports for community-led projects, independent legal, technical and financial advice for community-led projects, and a requirement for all projects to pay a fixed community benefit. I'm conscious of time, so just maybe to mention another couple of schemes that we've been involved with through the SCAI, the Dairy Farm Grant Scheme, which supports farmers in investing in energy efficient vacuum and milk pump technologies, with up to 40% of total technology installation costs covered. We're also working with agribusiness on the excellence in energy efficiency design, so building energy efficiency right into the concept stage when a facility is being designed. I suppose one of the key messages that I want to get across today is that we want to work with the sector. We accept fully in the Department of the Environment that we don't have all the answers, nor could we, because that's not our area of expertise. We have worked closely with Teagasc, who are obviously engaged on a day-to-day basis with farmers in the agri-food sector right across the country. We've worked closely with Brendan Gleeson and his team in the Department of Agriculture. We want to ensure that the things that you are being asked to do are not just challenging, but represent real opportunities for the sector over the next decade. And the development of the agri-food sector is about becoming better rather than just bigger, focusing on adding value to every unit of production, increasing the output and the value of every animal. Climate action and the future-proofing of Ireland's agri-food sector are intrinsically linked. Strong climate action will be essential to remaining competitive in a global marketplace driven by consumer expectations, and the Irish agricultural community will continue to step up and lead the way, I have no doubt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark. And if you'd stay on the panel, I would like also to invite up to the stage Roisin Hennerty and Oisín Coughlin. Roisin, of course, works with Ornua, Oisín of Friends of the Earth, and Andrew McHugh is a farmer from County Longford, referred to there as a smart farmer. All farmers are smart, I thought, and you're smarter than the rest.
Absolutely.
Just, Mark, can I go back to you first? I think the key, and it's very reassuring that you referred to constantly in the last 50 minutes or so the collaboration between yourselves and Teagasc and the Department of Agriculture. It makes common sense that that would happen. But do you still find that there's a lot of counterintuitive policy, in both departments in terms of policy and goals?
I wouldn't necessarily say they're counterintuitive. I mean, what we have to accept as a Department of the Environment is that we're there as part of a state system that wants to progress the three legs of the sustainable agenda, so economic, social, and environmental. The conversations that I have with Brendan and the people in the Department of Agriculture are always extremely civilized. We are focused on resolving issues. And the focus in the development of the Climate Action Plan is, well, what's an appropriate burden when you look across the various sectors? What should electricity contribute? What should transport contribute? What should the built environment contribute? And what should ag contribute? And we worked very close with McKinsey to come up with a suite of policies that represented the most cost-effective options within sectors and across sectors. And obviously in looking at the ag sector, we focused and didn't reinvent the work that Teagasc had done through the marginal abatement cost curve. What you will find, however, and it's interesting, I spoke to Thomas Ryan and to Andrew outside when we were having coffee earlier on. You do see policy inconsistencies emerge, and these become evident when farmers try to do things at local level. And Andrew had an example that he shared with me, and Thomas had a further example that he shared with me. And when you look at the Climate Action Plan, there's a couple of things that I draw out. First of all is communication. Like, we need to understand what's happening at local level, what's working and what's not working. And I had an opportunity a couple of months back to meet with the dairy processors as a group, to sit down and discuss the Climate Action Plan and say, well, what from your perspective works and what do you need? Where do you need the government to step in and do other things? And while I think the system is getting better at the cross-government collaboration and the whole of government stuff, there are still kind of policy gaps there that we need to resolve and fix.
Yeah.
The communication piece, I think, is critical, because we want to hear the voices on the ground that can feed back up into us. There's already good structures there that Oisín would be familiar with through the public participation networks and the work that the NGOs have done at local level that we want to build on and reach out and talk to the farmer on the ground and their representatives in the co-ops and so on, because the process that we've laid out it's not a plan that's set in stone until 2030, because things change, and we are reviewing this already to see where the plan needs to be reorientated, somewhat redesigned, or the burden reshared, because we know certain policies may or may not progress.
Well, for example, I suppose going back to my initial question, the proposal by Minister Bruton to plant 440 million trees by 2040, and announced by the government, great and all of that. Is that collaborative with the Department of Agriculture, with Teagasc? What's their response?
Absolutely. So I mean that measure would have been included in the plan following lengthy discussions with the stakeholders who understand this issue. I mean, I'm a guy who's worked in the Department of the Environment since the mid-1990s. I have a decent sense for how other sectors impact on the environment and what our role is and so on. I'm not a farmer. I mean, I'm never going to come up with a suite of measures that would make sense from a farming perspective. So we are going to rely to a large extent on the views that come from the stakeholders on the ground. We will obviously interrogate them, and we're building capacity in the department that will allow us, not cast a cold eye, but to be in a position to ask the hard questions where we see policies emerge that we would have some concern
Okay,
over.
I suppose just getting back to the theme, farming and the environment meeting the challenges, and that challenge is, as we said, to obviously feed a growing global population in an environmentally, animal welfare friendly way, but also sustaining rural communities and giving the primary producer a steady income. There are three pillars there, all achievable, hopefully, we would think at the same time, and that certainly is the aim. Roisin, I'll just kind of move on to you. You're the Managing Director of Ornua Global Foods Division, and I just want to get a perspective on you as somebody that's in 100 countries. How have consumers, because farmers will respond to their ultimate customer, the consumer, all of us, we're all consumers, but has consumer sentiment shifted hugely in the last 5, 10 years, or even in the last 2 or 3 years when it comes to people wanting to know how their food is produced and the provenance of that food? How has that, I suppose, crept up in terms of importance from your perspective?
Well, it's hugely important for consumers, and I suppose for us, we're very much focused in a world that has a global context. So we're always speaking to the issues for the consumer and for our customer. And look, our consumers have always made a selection. They've always chosen Irish dairy. We've added value to Irish milk through the Kerrygold brand, and they've made that selection on the basis of what we already represent, which is a grass-based feeding system. So it's very important. Increasingly, they're asking more questions. They're very well informed. And at the moment, our team receive more than 1,000 inquiries a week. Are they going very deep into some of the issues that we're talking about here today? Not necessarily, but the questions
what sort of a
continue to
trend
evolve.
have you noticed in that?
We've noticed they've moved away from simply wanting naturalness to understanding sustainability, and they certainly feel their own responsibility in making choices on shelf. But they're already making choices when they choose something like a Kerrygold product. The bigger issue where we're seeing that face on now is with customers. Suppliers are increasingly asking very detailed questions, and we've had to put a full-time resource on filling in and answering questions around animal welfare, the data points, the proof points on grass-fed, biodiversity, carbon, all of those different areas. So that's a very big issue for us.
And is price still, very much at the fore, or has ethics leapfrogged that in terms of what people are looking for?
I think it's really important to emphasise that we're adding value. We have always added value to milk. So our products are sold at a premium, and Irish Dairy can claim that premium. We already have a reputation for sustainability. We have a reputation for great tasting products. So that price challenge, as long as we can continue to collaborate around the data points and the proof points, for me would seem easier. That's one thing that we feel because in many markets, Kerrygold is the most expensive product on the shelf already, and people will make that choice and pay for that difference.
But certainly the idea of the provenance and the ethics and the sustainability of food production is becoming more of a consideration for you in terms of when you're innovating. I mean, I spoke to Patrick Coveney on the radio earlier this year, and he said 33% now, or 40% of their innovation now is around vegan and free-from products. Is that something that
I'm actually really, really glad you asked that question on free-from and flexitarian in particular. So I'd separate the two of them, and I would say in terms of free-from, apart from people with clinical issues, that to us is a trend, and we're still focused on trends. We were focused on them 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Go back to the 80s and 90s. We had fat-free. That was a free-from trend. We had the Atkins diet. So we see those things, ebbing and flowing through the categories that we operate in, and we feel very resilient around those. It's our job to defend brands and our products in that sense. In terms of flexitarian, I think we see that as more of an opportunity. People aren't saying we're going to eliminate dairy, for instance, from their diets. In that case, they're saying we want to be inclusive, we want to have a balance. And we're very much about making sure we have a place on the plate and reminding consumers of the facts around nutrition, dispelling a lot of the myths, reminding them in the case of dairy and Kerrygold, why it's good for them and how it can meet their nutritional needs, as well as tasting really good, which is important to consumers.
Okay, Andrew, you're responding in terms of the demands now that have been placed on you as a primary producer into the future because of what we're talking about here. We're in a climate emergency. Agriculture is very much part of that and needs to change. You're, I suppose, ahead of the curve as part of the Smart Farming Programme. Just can you give us an overview as to what is smart farming? What are you doing differently now? Are you more conscious of your role as a custodian of the countryside alongside being a food producer? Where is the balance there in what you do on a daily basis now?
Well, I suppose we're lucky in this country in that the IFA, in conjunction with the EPA, brought in loads of different agencies back in 2013, 2014, and drew up a program before climate change was a buzzword, before we had targets. And they looked at going out on farms, and I was one of the guinea pigs they went out onto. And so I was lucky I had loads of advisors, or unlucky, whichever way you want to put it. And they looked at every area on the farm, be it from feed to water to soils to what you do with your nutrients in slurry and so on, and fertilizers, to your milk output, the genetics, grass growing, the whole lot. And said, where can farmers use their resources better, and how can they use them better to either cut their costs or to improve their output, but at the same time reduce carbon emissions. And they picked up on all those areas, and generally the two of them were the same. Such as in areas, if you improve the genetics, your cows last longer. So if they last longer, they produce more, and you need less young stock, you reduce your carbon emissions. Grow grass for longer, graze it for longer, you make more money, and you reduce your emissions. So there was loads and loads of areas, just technical areas on the farms, and I then had to share what they advised me to do with our discussion group. And I was in a discussion group anyway then, but our focus generally was on grass and genetics. And I now see 5 years on how all the advisors around the country, be they independent advisors, Teagasc advisors and so on, they have all the things that I was told then, they naturally tell all farmers now.
Are you organic?
No.
Right. So what about in terms of fertilizer and feed? Have you changed there? Is that part of the program as well?
It is, yeah, absolutely. So it's getting more output for the similar amount of feed, or reducing your feed to get the same output. Again, saving resources, saving money, and less carbon output. Fertilizers this year, again, the last couple of years, the big thing has been change to protected urea, reduce your ammonia emissions. So I changed to protected urea this year. There's low emission slurry spreading, that's putting it on the ground, less ammonia in the air. So my tanker had to be changed this year. I've ordered a new one, and it kind of shows what agriculture is doing in Ireland. You now have a 6-month wait to get a tanker because there's such a demand for them.
So just give me a couple of headline figures in terms of, number one, how did your balance sheet change, your margins from, we'll say, when you began to where you are now, and how were you able to demonstrate that you improved the carbon footprint on your farms? Just give us those two headline figures.
Initially, they said I should be able to improve my income by 9,000 per year if I made the changes. Now, prices change every year, so you can't exactly put, has my income grown in the last 5 years? Yes, it has.
Okay.
Carbon emissions, we have the Origin Green, and they have a carbon monitor in that. Through that, they reckoned I should have been able to reduce my carbon emissions by 20% over a 5-year period. Most of that coming through genetics, through the EBI. I'm afraid I'm not a scientist. I assume it's improved.
But I just wanted to ask you in general. So it sounds to me it's a win-win. You've more money in your pocket. The environment and biodiversity in that part of County Longford where you're living is benefiting. There has to be a catch, people say, or else every farmer should be doing this. Is there an initial cost, an initial buy-in first?
There's initially, a farmer has to agree to have somebody advise them. Most people, as they get older, are more resistant to change, and some people are naturally resistant to change. So, to my mind, things have changed in the agriculture industry over the last 5 years dramatically, more than I've probably seen them change previously at a greater rate. But the two things that really affect change are getting advisors onto the ground, helping people on a one-to-one basis. And that is happening more and more over the last number of years. Knowledge transfer schemes, co-ops bringing in their joint programs and so on. And the other thing is getting youth, because youth are far more adaptable to change.
Okay, Oisín, listening to Andrew there, does that satisfy, I suppose, the demands from your perspective as an environmentalist? Has he done enough? And if that was replicated at a greater scale around the country, is that what we need to actually do? And would that, I suppose, satisfy the demands that you would have from I suppose, your lobby perspective?
I think the smart farming model and the smart farming pilot program, I guess you'd call it, is really interesting and has a lot of lessons for us in how we do a transition in the farm sector. And I'll say more about that. Just, of course, it's not about satisfying my demands.
Sure, it's all, yeah.
It's about.
But I'm wondering, does it go far enough in terms?
Well, I'll comment on that because it's the reality check here is that, and Mark alluded to this, is the atmospheric challenge, the global challenge, which the latest science suggests we have to reduce our emissions globally by almost half by 2030. And to near zero, to net zero as it's called, by 2050. That is a massive transformation on a global scale, equivalent to the agricultural or the industrial revolutions. And it's a climate emergency, as you hear now, and declared by the Dáil, because we have to do now in 10 years, 2030, what we should have done over 30 years. So everything is compressed in terms of timescale. And that makes it very challenging in all sectors, in transport, in housing, in energy, maybe less so, but there too, and certainly in farming. So we're all going to have to change, but obviously the choice now isn't between change and not change. It's between managed change that meets both the climate challenge and maintains a thriving rural economy, in this case, or economy more generally, or between not changing fast enough and having instead the abrupt, disruptive change of climate chaos, of climate impacts that we're seeing in other parts of the world. We're seeing in the Amazon, we're seeing in rising sea levels and in
But
storms.
has the focus in this country on farming been totally disproportionate? Not taking into account the fact that it is our largest industry, and are farmers an easy target in all of this? When you talk there about all the other facets that contribute to our emissions.
I don't know if disproportionate is the right word. I agree with you. We focus a lot on farming, and it's for a funny bunch of reasons. One of them is because there's a very organised advocacy and industry groups in farming that don't exist in transport, for example. I'd be the first to say transport's the one that gets off the hook here. It's increased its emissions almost threefold in 30 years. Agriculture is only now beginning to increase its emissions compared to 30 years ago, and yet we have these debates about agriculture. It's partly, of course, because the media like a good fight, and they tried to have a fight between environmentalists and farmers. It isn't as easy. For some reason, the interest groups aren't as concentrated in transport.
But I wonder, are people with other agendas piggybacking the climate agenda to have a go at farmers in terms of particularly dairy and beef farmers?
I don't know if that's true. I think we have a real challenge both in Ireland and globally around the transition that has to happen, and that there's plenty to talk about without introducing other topics. I mean, you asked me about the smart farming example, and the more I hear about it, the more it reminds me of the same sort of challenge that we have, say, on housing, except it's even bigger, I guess. So over the years, looking at how we encourage people to retrofit, it becomes clearer that actually you don't talk about climate change. You talk about a warmer home, lower fuel bills, and actually healthier air when you move from solid fuel to heat pumps. And by the way, it reduces your pollution and reduces your emissions. And that's the offering you make. But one of the clearest things is it's not just about the money, which is a challenge in housing, as in where does the investment come from. It's the project management, it's the accompaniment. It's why you have to have a Tipperary Energy Agency for every county. People who will bring you through the process, advisors. And listening to Andrew and the scheme, and having talked to the IFA about that scheme, it's a similar model. You're working with farmers on the value proposition, on the resource efficiency proposition. Oh, and by the way, it reduces your environmental impact. But it's still not at scale, obviously, and they're not claiming it's at scale. It's a pilot project, essentially. And we need to look with the Department of Agriculture and with your department, Mark, at how we make that available to all farmers. Now, in some cases, it might be that it's a common standard for advisors, whether they're from Teagasc, whether they're from co-ops, whether they're from IFA or from NGOs who want to offer farmers that opportunity. But it needs to become, first of all, attractive to all farmers and then available to all farmers. But even then, it probably isn't going to be enough. Resource efficiency alone may not be enough, but it's the obvious first step. But we are going to have to look at diversification of income, both in terms of farm practices and in terms of energy. We're in lockstep with the IFA on the opportunities that solar provides for rural incomes, and the department hasn't moved fast enough. The words are sounding good now, but we're going to need to look at that really fast to get for community buildings and farm buildings to become locally owned power plants.
Okay. Roisin, yeah, come in there, Mark, yeah?
That has arisen, that the agriculture sector are being disproportionately targeted, in the context of the Climate Action Plan. But if you look at the extent of the ask across the other sectors, it is more significant, particularly in transport. I mean, the scale of changes required in transport between now and 2030 is enormous. They are a big emitter. They do need to change.
But we're going to build another runway in Dublin Airport.
I'm talking about ground transport.
Okay.
So they are going to have to make massive changes. We are going to have to make massive changes as a society over the next 10 years in the transport sector. Built environment, as Oisín has said, again, an enormous change required in terms of new building standards which have come on stream and which would be very helpful in this regard, but massive investment in the existing housing stock to get it up to levels that improve the comfort for people, but also lower emissions. So we were conscious, in putting the plan together, that we got the right balance. We do believe that the science that's behind it is sound. We will continue to reorientate, reconfigure, and rebalance as the measures.
But can I ask a question? Isn't it your department that's responsible for areas such as renewable energy and bioenergy? And farmers, they have the tools. They're ready to go in a lot of cases. But there's no incentive, and we still have no incentives. We had the Teagasc conference in Gertine a few weeks ago. Farmers said, I would have no problem growing bioenergy crops on my farm, maybe getting rid of the cattle to do it. But he said, where's the end buyer, the end user? They've been, they were stung before. Why is there no incentive in that area, which would obviously help offset an awful lot of...
Again, Damien, there are a suite of actions in the Climate Action Plan that will deal with this, and they are there in black and white, and as the government department that has responsibility for this, we'll be called out on it very soon. For example, we have to deliver the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme by the end of this year. So first major auction, we have to deliver microgen over the next few months with an appropriate feed-in tariff. We have to deliver, working with the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities and with EirGrid, the type of connection policy that needs to be in place to ensure that large-scale, medium-scale and smaller scale can feed back into the market and get a rate of return on the electricity they'll sell back into the market.
Okay, Oisín, briefly, and I want to bring Oisín in.
Until recently, we would have, of course, said there wasn't the political leadership or the administrative imperative around delivering some of these schemes generally. And I think there is to a great degree now, but there's also a bottleneck just in terms of human resources. And I said this to the Taoiseach this week. I don't think Mark's department has enough staff to be able to deliver the Climate Action Plan itself. I mean, for example, a year ago, that plan wasn't imagined because the minister hadn't looked for it yet. So even delivering the plan meant there was less people working on the res. They need more staff to actually develop the schemes and do due diligence to actually deliver the kind of good ideas that are out there.
Okay, Roisin, you're somebody that obviously was in the US and helped drive the success of Kerrygold. The USP was, of course, the grass-fed, natural background and all of that. Is the sheen of that marketing slogan beginning to disappear? Does it work on its own anymore? Or is Ireland and grass-fed and green, this image, is it still giving us a competitive advantage? Or is it being, I suppose, eroded by changing attitudes towards dairy and beef as animal proteins?
I think there's a few questions in there, Damien. The first one is, are we still a product of choice? And the answer is yes. We're experiencing growth in all of the categories in our key markets, so that's really important. I think we can't underestimate the preference for dairy. So at the moment, in the places and markets and regions that we serve, we are continuing to see very strong growth. You have to remember that this conversation that we're having today, which is really important, is quite complex around climate action. But when you go to the markets where, like if you go to the US, as you just mentioned there, the choice the consumer is making is to not choose dairy products from highly intensified farms, as we have in the US using feedlots, but the choice is to have product from small family farms on a grass-based system in Ireland. We have a huge competitive advantage. We still have it, but as an industry, it's really important that we collaborate on the proof points. Schemes like the Sustainable Dairy Assurance Scheme and Origin Green will support that, but we need to work very hard so that we can own and continue to own that differentiation point on shelf. Consumers want that, and they're asking for it, and we need to serve them in that way.
Okay, I suppose a question for you all, and that is that we have, projects such as Foodwise 2025, Food Harvest 2020, and now there's another one coming in 2030, which all demands greater output, greater value, and greater exports. Can we meet those targets while at the same time meeting our climate change targets? Are they counterintuitive, to use that phrase I used earlier on? Andrew, what do you think? Can we increase output of dairy and beef to sell to emerging markets around the world, while at the same time meeting our climate change targets?
I think in many ways, if agriculture is to be there for the next generation, we must, because to have a viable income, people have to be able to grow. Agriculture in this country, if you compare it to most other countries around the world, look at Holland, look at New Zealand, look at so many other countries, we have a very low output relative to our land base. And yet, you look at those who have viable incomes generally have the higher output. It's generally those older people who are retiring who have the lower output. So if you want young people coming in, you're going to have higher output from the country. We can do it. It would be very challenging from the climate change, the overall figures. We are improving continuously, but it'll be challenging to meet the targets we have to meet. But there are new technologies coming out the whole time. I'm on a Nefertiti group, I think, which is Teagasc and all these other members who collaborate across Europe on the carbon sequestration and so on. And it's funny how you see soils will hold more carbon, sequester more carbon, if they're intensively managed rather than extensively managed.
Right.
So it's so complicated. You can increase intensity and reduce carbon, but it's hard.
Okay, Oisín, on that, the Paris Accord on one side of the table, Foodwise 2025 on the other side, are they compatible?
I think the next plan will need to be significantly different in its model. I think that debate needs to go deep into the models of growth that we're looking at. Because efficiency, as I said earlier, is great. It's the first step. It's not going to be enough. Emissions actually have to come down. And the EPA projections at the moment still have them going up in agriculture between now and 2030. The plan for 2030 has to see emissions coming down. Now, they won't be coming down as fast as they will in other sectors in that period. And the plan for 2050 has to see emissions probably in agriculture come down by at least 50%. The rest of the economy will be going to zero. And agriculture will have to come to at least 50% below. So we need to start planning for that now. It means diversification in income sources and probably in product types. And so both from all aspects of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental, we can't bet the farm, so to speak, on ever-increasing herd size, ever-increasing product, ever-increasing growth. We have to look at a more diverse model.
Okay, Mark, on that, and I mean, this is what we're looking for here today, our solutions. We know the challenges that are out there, and it is about the three pillars. We talk about it once again. That is keeping Andrew in business down in County Longford, meeting our climate change targets, and keeping the people in rural Ireland, the merchants and many of the members here who are involved in family businesses that feed off a vibrant and viable dairy and beef sector in particular, whatever about all the other enterprises that we have around the country, but they're the ones in the firing line. Can we meet those 3 targets from your perspective, standing somewhat outside the sphere of agriculture?
So, I mean, it's quite clear that the government remains very ambitious for the sector, and that you would expect that Foodwise 2025, the successor thereof, will be an ambitious program around food production, sustainable food production. You will need to see part of that which says, well, we recognize that in doing that, maybe we need to move away to some of the traditional ways of doing it. It's not just about numbers, it's about being more efficient. It's about getting more from the individual beast or the individual farm. It's about deploying the type of things that Andrew's doing in terms of smart farming. But I think the answer actually lies with the people in the room here. They really need to be thinking about the opportunities that a different type of consumer, a different type of agriculture model bring, while at the same time ensuring that Ireland, which has this tradition for sustainable food production and needs to be part of the solution to feeding the 9 billion that we heard of earlier, will still remain part of that solution and a well-recognised green, sustainable food producer within the EU.
Okay. Briefly, a few seconds to finish with you, Roisin, on that. What is your message, for your customers? What's your message to your suppliers then, based on, I suppose, where we're going? Is it a positive message that Ornua has for your suppliers, your shareholders around the country into the future?
Absolutely. We've invested for decades in building markets around the world, and we can't lose sight of that. We're very relevant in those markets, and as long as we continue to supply them, it'll be important. We want to invest our resources and our funding in ways that we can collaborate with the industry and support the change that needs to happen. Programs like those advocated by Teagasc and indeed the department are very important. We're investing in new technologies to try and bring transparency to the supply chain to support all of the different data points that we're going to continue to need to supply to our customers and our consumers. So for us, we need to stay focused. We need to be collaborating very quickly. Time is moving on here, and the consumer and the customer are leading us on that.
All right, it's time to sustain our stomachs by going out and getting something to eat. And I just want to say it's been very interesting. Thank you all for your time and cooperation over the last couple of days in chatting to you first and preparing for today. It's a really, really important debate which is going to continue, but it's about solutions, and it's good to hear that there are solutions out there, and there are ways of tackling all of the challenges that face us all as consumers, farmers and environmentalists. Ladies and gentlemen, our thanks to our panel. So enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you a little after 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.